and it's recording now. So welcome to Just Hospitality, which is the second presentation of the seminar, which I originally prepared for our National ISM Staff Conference in Phoenix, January 2018. And so I'm really excited to have you folks here. Like such high caliber people in the room, so I'm honored. I'd love to start with just brief introductions. And so what I'd love to know from you is, what is your cultural or ethnic background? And where have you lived for 2 or more years outside the US? So, you know, name, cultural, ethnic background, however you describe that, where you've lived cross-culturally or outside the US. And then, yeah, we'll keep it at that. So, Paul, would you mind starting us?
Yeah, Paul, I have definitely a majority culture white background. Grew up in upstate New York with not much ethnic or racial diversity around me. I've not had the privilege of living 2 years or more overseas, experiences in Pakistan, China, multiple times, Korea, Ecuador for 2 weeks to 2 months. And third part, Rachel, was third part of the introduction.
Yeah, was, sorry, oops, give me a moment. That was it for now.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more thing after. Thank you.
Hospitality has always been a big part of my life cross-culturally since I was a little runt of a kid.
Thank you. Darren?
So my background is also mishmash of white Anglo-Saxon, so Irish, German, others I can't even remember. Scottish is in there. Some others. I'm about an eighth. I can't remember if it's an eighth or 1/16 Nez Perce Native American, and which is a tribe in Oregon where my dad's side of the family is, and I'm married to a Latina also. That's a mixed part of the ethnic tapestry that my life's woven into now. My wife's Argentine and Puerto Rican. And we lived for about 7.5 years in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a land where identity and ethnic issues are just really unimportant to people. They just kind of ignore them most of the time. No, not true at all. The opposite of that.
Wow. Wonderful. Sharon?
Yeah, my background is white, German Swiss, basically. Germanic is really kind of the background of the Midwest in general, and that's where I've lived my entire life. So we really picked that up and held tightly to it. And then I moved to Wisconsin, where it's even more German and Norwegian than anywhere else, including Germany and Norway. And I have not lived anywhere else outside of the U.S. I've only lived in Illinois and Wisconsin.
Thank you. Mark?
So I have lived in the U.S. My whole life as well. I'm from a Hungarian background. My grandparents immigrated in the 1910s on my father's side. Some German, Scots, and Irish on my mama's side. Her maiden name was McDaniel. And yeah, I grew up in a very white suburb of Columbus, Ohio. I did live on the East Coast for 8 years and graduate school in Canada. So I guess I did live in Canada, but yeah, otherwise, in Cleveland, Ohio.
Nice. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Katie?
I grew up in the South. It's mostly more Celtic, Scotch, and Irish, English background. And if you add all the times I've been to France together, that adds about 2 years, actually about 2.5 years.
Okay.
I was an international student and then a researcher in France.
Okay. I'm taking some notes because I'm just really fascinated. Great. Okay. Well, my turn. So I come from ancestry from Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, England, Ireland, in Netherlands. And got the chance to explore that earlier last year on my sabbatical, on my Europe voyage for 2 months, traveling around learning about my background. And I grew up in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then lived in California for 10 years and now Hawaii for almost 4 years. And so as I'm a true TCK, wondering always throughout my life, where is home, and having to choose that, choose into that. So thank you so much. And one other question, just to kind of intro us, is think for a moment, when you've been traveling and staying in someone's home, what is one thing that you just really appreciated about their hospitality? So just maybe take a couple seconds to think, and then I'll prompt us to share. So I think for me, one thing I really appreciate is the person like taking the time to sit down and maybe make a cup of tea and just chat, you know, and share their story and listen to mine. I think as when I'm a host, I often feel busy, more like Martha aspect of like trying to make sure everything's in order. And so I really admire and appreciate that when people take the time just to kind of like disclose and to listen. Yeah, who else would like to share?
I think one of the things I've noticed is I really appreciate it when I feel like I'm kind of part of the home. It's like if someone asked me to like help them get drinks or tea together for somebody, or like, hey, could you hand me that thing over there, or something like that, where we're interacting in a way that it feels like, oh yeah, I've been not just invited in, but like kind of accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like not just a guest, but almost part of the family. Like, and I know you love to serve, Sharon, so that makes sense. Who else?
I like the balance of enough engagement and not too much. I like it when someone, it makes me feel more like I'm at home in their home. If they want to talk and want to share, but then also are content to go do their thing. They got to do, take care of their kids, take care of their family, go to bed, you know, and also give me space too. I don't know, that interplay makes it feel more like you're joining someone's life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Paul, I saw you were unmuted.
I just think authentic and personal. I love when you come into a space, a home with guests where, you know, they just are welcoming you as they are and want you to be as you are. So it could be special and well-prepared space or time, or it could be just, hey, I'm watching the kids over here. Grab a seat. Do you want something to drink? Oh, come out here. It'll be easier to talk, right? I feel like it's great to just join people in their life as it really is, not in only a contrived environment.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So let's be real. Live life like we really do. Yeah. Great. And anyone else, Katie or Mark, would you like to say something?
Not particularly.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move us into the presentation as I share my screen here. And thank you so much for sharing. And it's like neat because a lot of just the aspects of hospitality that we love, I see that as kind of a metaphor for what my presentation is about in a more kind of foundational way. So just hospitality, bringing our whole cultural selves as we welcome the nations. And so we already did our introductions, and I want to just kind of give a bit of a framework for what I'm sharing here. And so our theme for our ISM conference was Christ's redemptive mission in a divided world. And so what does it look like to host well in terms of place, language, and mess? And so this is the questions that I'll have posted at the end for us to consider more deeply, but just to kind of give the overall big picture, we're going to be considering place both in two main ways. Who are the hosts of the land? In this case, Native Indigenous peoples or others that have migrated and made that home. What is my migration story, each of our migration stories? In terms of language, how might languages in international student ministry be shared in a way that breaks barriers and also, creates a safe place of hospitality for all? And then lastly, mess. And I liked how Paul kind of brought that up in what he shared about something he appreciates in hospitality is people that are just who they are. They're their real selves, and maybe they're doing childcare. Maybe they're disciplining their child, right? But you get to see that you get to be a part of the whole thing. Or it was sharing, maybe they're asking her to like grab a mug so they can prepare tea, and she gets to be part of that. So in terms of mess, what are the issues in our nation nation or state or community that are relevant and things we shouldn't hide? And what are national issues that maybe folks, international guests, are seeing on the news and are trying to grapple with, and how do we talk about those things? So here's some of the foundational theology. All of this is, I feel like what I'm communicating are some really big ideas that could be broken down into like at least 2 longer talks or like 5. And so I just want to kind of warn you that it's a bit of a quick ride. But foundational theology, creation mandate in Genesis 1:28, I feel like really is a powerful one for me. Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And so this is the first thing that Creator really said or kind of mandated to humans, and it was expand, right? And there's some important role that we see Adam has in the garden to steward and care for it. And the Lord wants people in his land and, across the earth to care for it. And that seems to be part of his intention. And so even when, Babel happened, there was a grace of God even then to disperse them through languages to fulfill this mandate. And then also Paul in Acts 17, when he's giving his talk in Athens, he references this idea that from one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the earth, and he marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. He did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And so my Native Indigenous friends have shared a lot with me from this framework, that the places in which their people have lived for hundreds, thousands of years, often time immemorial, before we have any kind of documented history, are the places that they were given to steward and also reach out and know God the Creator, and also know the person of Jesus Christ through even maybe a more special revelation. And so there's something so significant, right, about those people of the lands. And so that's something I want to go a little bit deeper in later. But first, or next, my story. So I come from a missionary background of 3 generations. And the little, I don't know how to point, but this little child in the middle, the smallest one, is my little mommy, Ruthie. And her parents, she was born and raised in Tokyo. Spent her first 18 years growing up in Japan along with her 5 siblings. And so after World War II, my grandpa felt the call after a kind of word from General MacArthur to go and bring the gospel to these Japanese who have now been humbled in war and are more open to the message of Jesus Christ. And so he and my grandma answered that call. They spent 37 years in Japan. They also were part of buying the land and setting up Ochanomizu Christian Center, which today houses our KGK, InterVarsity IFES movement, and many other Christian ministries. So it's really an honor to walk in that legacy. And I have so much admiration and respect for them. In fact, the other day I was just like, I wish I could just like sit down with them again and hear stories. But they're with Jesus. And so one day we'll do that again. But I think we can celebrate the good and also make note of things that we don't want to perpetuate from the past. And so here's also my grandma in a kimono, so sweet. But here's another picture of a church they helped to plant. And, you know, as we look at the Japanese church today, it retains so much Western form in ways that the American church, right, has moved far beyond. And Japan is known to preserve a lot of things and cultures. And yet when my Japanese returnees go home, it's really hard for them to re-enter, partly for this reason. So there were misses in that generation of cultural contextualization, right? What were the ways that my grandparents' generation could have been more culturally aware so that they did not set up a Western-style church, but helped to kind of guide a process of an indigenous church being formed and established? So moving on, without going deeper in that, second generation, the little girl in this picture is me and my exuberant brother. And my parents met as language students in China right after the Cultural Revolution. They were some of those that smuggled, you know, materials in from Hong Kong. So really, they can't ever tell me to not do something risky. So I have that to hold them to. And so they raised my brother and I in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I just feel totally blessed and enriched. I feel like I was hosted very well in those nations as a guest. And because of that, have a high value for hosting international as well in the land of my own nationality. Third generation, here's me surrounded by a bunch of international friends in Hawaii after one of our hiking events. And a lot of the folks we interact with, majority are Japanese. And then we have also a lot of Chinese. I have a friend who's Taiwanese in the picture. And so really, like, I get to live into that legacy of the previous two generations and the gifts that they gave me. And of course, I also want to bring even more cultural sensitivity and relevance into what I do. So now we're getting a little bit into the nitty-gritty. White models. So that's also me and my brother modeling for a clothing company in Taiwan. And I think at the time I enjoyed, you know, the glamour of having my makeup done and getting photographed. I'm totally fine being on stage. I'm a comfortable public speaker, perhaps because of these positive experiences. But at the time, of course, I didn't have the nuanced perspective of seeing how my whiteness was being elevated in maybe an unhealthy way in this cultural context where I was a guest. A couple other pictures. I did some silly stuff. Here's me on an inversion table. Even better, my parents and I, as they were, you know, acting as old people, because really they were so, you know, such young 50-year-olds at the time. And here I was the caregiver for my elderly parents. So we had a lot of laughs about that. But what are the ways in which in which Asia, you know, has perceived the West? And I'm going to make specific, you know, applications, but then this can be broadened to a lot of other contexts or compared. But what are the ways in which Asia has bent to the West, perhaps because of missions, but also other types of trade and foreign policy, in a way that's unhealthy and doesn't honor the cultures in the land? So I'm looking at this as a metaphor, right? Where I, as a young person, was kind of idolized for my skin color and hair color. I'm not being especially particularly attractive, but being white and, you know, getting financial opportunities to teach English, getting stopped to take photos, even at Taipei 101 when it was the tallest building in the world, in the capital city of, and even this very interesting instance when I was in junior high. I was in a science museum, and some students had come from an outer kind of city that wasn't our main city, and so they hadn't maybe ever seen a foreigner before except on TV. And so we're in a science museum, and they come up to me and say, "Can we have a piece of your hair?" And, you know, no big deal, right? But in Chinese, 金色头发, it's golden. So I'm like, here, sure, have a piece of my hair. Later, they come back and give me a gift from the bookstore. And I just feel like, wow, grateful, but there's something uncomfortable about that, right? Because, like, why would there be such an elevation of who I am because of my appearance? There's ways that Asians try to mimic, you know, Western beauty standards in painful leg lengthening surgeries, a lot of hair dye to look lighter or kind of more blonde or brown. And then, you know, eyelid surgeries as well to have a double eyelid. And an online magazine critiqued it this way, saying Asian double eyelid surgery has long been the subject of controversy and debate about prevailing westernized beauty standards and cultural rejection. So, you know, if this is kind of what folks might come into with some of these preconceived notions, it begets us as some of the hosts, you know, to be very aware, right, of what we don't want to perpetuate, not only in their cultural ideas, but also their spiritual ideas. Mm-hmm. So Brenda Salter McNeil in The Heart of Racial Reconciliation talks about how false cultural identities come up when folks don't love themselves and their own cultural skin and tend to bend toward another culture or take on its attributes. I think I tend to do this sometimes when I don't feel comfortable with white American history or European history. But how can I be aware of what I'm exporting? So here's some potential cultural idols. Whiteness, the power and privilege that comes with whiteness that might be mimicked. English as a vehicle to power and success. I was teaching English when I was like in junior high to kids and also adults and getting paid good money for it, you know. As American Idol is just kind of this cute way I'm trying to typify like the American dream or, you know, ideal of reaching fame, wealth, and happiness through kind of an American nationality or something like that. So give me a moment. So now that's kind of like the past of my story, but now bringing it today in the current context. Oh wait, but before I do that, I do want to just pause and kind of give some space for any thoughts or questions, recognizing that, you know, I've talked about some things that are hard to acknowledge about my own culture, but also cultures that I interact with our host. So any feedback or relatable experiences, thoughts, questions?
I'll just add that
Yeah.
I agree. I say amen to a lot of this stuff. As a white male, I'm aware of privileges, and I'm increasingly aware, as I can always go deeper, but also in our life in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was aware that I could leverage a lot of that stuff, whiteness, English language, and even like stereotypes of American to connect with students. I could use that. I could leverage that, but it was like also this little bit of false fruit where it could be, I want to say, tantalizing students to things they're drawn towards that weren't necessarily going to be helpful in the long run for our ministry. But it's reality, you know. I mean, that was part of like it was always a ever-present either temptation or just something, you know, oh, they're interested in American things, so therefore we can key off that. But then also, where will that leave us down the road, especially if you look at them trying to stay integrated with their own culture and not just try to escape it. So there's a lot more to say there, but that's just some
thoughts. No, that's right on. And I'd love to say hello to your little girl. What's her name?
This is Nora. Nora, can you say hi to my friend Rachel there?
Hi.
Hi, Nora. So good to have you join us. How old are you?
Good to have you join us. How old are you? How old are you?
5.
That's really big. I heard you're already a reader.
Mm-hmm.
Keep up the good work. Aw. Anyone else? I know, Katie, you're unmuted. Is that because you wanted to speak, or?
I was just wondering, are you implying that one should never use English as a ministry, as a way of serving people?
Good question. So I don't want to go to that extreme. I don't think that's true. But I think if we can be aware of more of the implicit things that might come across, that we can be more sensitive in how, you know, we might leverage English or American identity in mission.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions at this point? Okay. I'm going to resume the...
Can I ask a question, Rachel?
Yep.
On the slide, you have whiteness, power, and privilege. Are you saying that that's just a feature of whiteness, or that is what whiteness is? I've heard it used in both ways. You know, that the whiteness, by using whiteness
Right.
and not white or Caucasian or something, you're talking about the nature of something, right? With whiteness, are you
Yeah.
poor is power and privilege, or that it actually is, that's what whiteness is power and privilege?
I think great question. I think we could, have a 3-hour discussion on this. I think the more I read and learn and research and, have traveled and try to perceive things from Europe, there's actually been cultural constructs of white supremacy. And so while whiteness, as we know, is redeemed in Jesus and isn't inherently superior or powerful and privileged in itself, I think it's been formed into that in the last 400 or 500 years, especially through colonization from Europe toward other countries. Is that satisfying for now, or would you like to ask a follow-up question?
No, I think that's fine. Yeah,
Okay.
It's a hot concept or hot word, these days about what it means.
It really is. It really
but
is.
It's more than just saying that Caucasians tend to be those who move toward power and privilege, but there's something called whiteness that is, as you've said, a doctrine of racial supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that phrase kind of captures it well. There has been a doctrine of racial supremacy that, our international students probably wouldn't use that verbiage. But if we can be aware of that, then we can be more aware of how to not perpetuate that, both culturally as well as spiritually, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm getting after here. But yeah, Rachel, I would love to talk more.
Rachel, I appreciate how, you included some of your family journey, especially how you were shaped and how you were even used, not misused, but used, in terms of as a model and these things, I think, and then, I thought the timing was perfect. Darren, having your 5-year-old daughter, Nora, show up. I think, it's great to talk about this as staff and adults, but we understand that these values and the things about what we're exporting and what we express is formed often in the home or in our family context. And so it's certainly been precisely the cross-cultural experiences in this country and living in China and in France and in Korea, where our daughter Hannah, at different ages was very aware that she was sort of a celebrity status because of her English, because of her looks, and, on a boat down the Yangtze River, together with Chinese models, they lined her up because she was a white American. So, she was really perplexed by that. It was both attractive and flattering, but it was kind of like, I don't get why they want a 9-year-old in the picture with 20 and 30-year-old models, So I think just knowing that we're responsible, not just to talk about it with one another and our students, but to frame how we bring this up in our families, the dinner conversations, all of that is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Paul. And just to give my parents some credit, I think they saw the opportunity in modeling and the financial help toward college, as we as missionaries didn't make that much, but also we're trying to make sure I didn't get a big head about it and think I was something really special and amazing. So I'm really grateful for that forming. I think that's really important. And so thanks for also bringing that up, Paul, and also Darren mentioned experience as a white person, in another country. Well, we might not be able to shift like a national mindset in another nation. We can do a real service of, while they're in the U.S. context, the place that we act as hosts or serve as hosts, to kind of do a good job affirming, right, their culture, and even breaking down some of what's beautiful and also maybe not so beautiful about our own in this space. So that's kind of what I'm after, thinking about hospitality in terms of justice and justice issues. So thank you so much, you guys, for your perspectives. It's really rich feedback, and I'll bring us back to the presentation now, if that's okay. Okay, good. So a bit of, can you see the screen again? You share, okay, there, I think I have to share it one more time. All right. Are we back on the presentation? Can I get a thumb up? We are. Okay, good. So a bit of my current context. Why is this not moving? Oh, too far. Oh, okay. Well, That's where we're going to be. So I was living in Northern California, 95% white, and went to college there and also served on staff there at a community college. And so for me, being invited to join the team in Hawaii and plant a ministry to international students was really exciting and life-giving, partly because I got to live overseas and cross-culturally again, and also because being among international students feels like I get to be my true and full self. Working with white Americans, I almost had to like put on a white American aspect of myself, whereas really I think in such a different paradigm as a TCK. So in Hawaii, I felt particularly called into this environment before I was invited to do ISM. But because of a problem and a deep wound. And that is that just brief history, 1820 missionaries arrived from New England and Hawaii. Because the elite or the royalty were already favorable toward the Christian missionaries. The gospel was easily and well received, and in a matter of a couple decades, all of Hawaii was considered Christian. If not, deeply spiritually Christian, they were considered politically Christian, also among the community of nations. Meanwhile, they really admired the British political system and established a constitutional monarchy modeled after England, and had trade agreements and were globally recognized all over the globe, but especially European powers and Asian powers. So they're part of what preceded the United Nations, the Community of Nations. 3 generations after the original missionaries arrived and had then been released from their responsibility once the nation had become Christian, the white missionary community still held power in the church and didn't hand it over to indigenous leadership. And the missionaries themselves and descendants started doing business in the land with sugar, pineapple, other things that required land acquisition. And so over time, this led to more and more involvement and manipulation in politics, and to the eventual illegal overthrow in 1893 among this missionary party, as they're called by the Queen in her autobiography, other businessmen, and the U.S. Navy, which was out of compliance with the U.S.'s intentions. There was an investigation done after by the president. It was called an act of war by insurgents. That's a story that most of us that even know a lot about global affairs probably haven't heard. I think it's not something the U.S. is necessarily proud about. There has been a formal apology in 1993 by President Bill Clinton, although there's been no evident reparations of that, that the Hawaiian community would feel is worthwhile, which I think can be said for also a lot of our Native American communities across the United States, right? There's been a pretty rocky history from initial nation-to-nation agreements to, kind of forced migrations, to all-out genocide, to policies that still keep indigenous peoples off their lands. So we have a real kind of problem on our hands, right, that I think a lot of us have explored in various ways. But what is this? How does this come into play, in our work with international students? It wouldn't necessarily initially seem like it has a huge relationship, but I suggest that it does have a really important and significant relationship. Here's a picture of my staff team, and I'm super blessed to learn from them. About half the team has Native Hawaiian ancestry, and also a lot of Asian mix, and the other half that is not of of Native Hawaiian ancestry is Asian. And so I'm super blessed to learn from them, and as you can tell, I'm the only white person on my staff team, and that's been a good and hard journey. While I still am white and have that power and privilege and that voice, I also have a dissenting voice in some ways, and so it's good to kind of like learn both perspectives, or I get to be that minority person that speaks up for my people group, which many of our friends of color experience all the time. I had the opportunity to visit the NATES symposium also during my sabbatical in 2017 in June, And NATES, in case you don't know, is the acronym for North American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies. You might have heard the name Richard Twiss. He's really been influential in our movement and published this book that came out in staff mailing, Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys. And this actually was published after he passed away, unfortunately at a young age. But he's really contributed so much to our discussions and surgeon in the Urbana Forum, along with those that continue to lead NATES. And so while I was there as a learner, I was especially impressed by this quote from a native Hawaiian graduate of the program with his master's. And he said this: "It's important to learn how to be a good guest, because when you receive well, you give well. When you are a good guest, blessings come. When you are a good host, you don't introduce bad guests to others." So he uses the language of guest and host, but in terms of how we live in the land. So it might beg the question, who's the guest and who's the host, right? And in terms of ISM ministry, we as the Americans or ISM staff are often the host. And yet, when we think more historically in our own migration stories, who are the hosts of the lands in which we live? And so I would offer that they are the Native Indigenous communities. And we may have varying, experiences with those communities in the lands in which we live now. And Darren also shared that he has some Native American ancestry. So I would love if you have anything to offer on that, either now or I can see if it, connects with you later. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Not at this point. Keep going.
Okay.
We'll jump in later.
Thanks, Darren. Sure. And so what does it mean for us to learn from the Native Indigenous peoples of our lands? As we are guests in their land, how do they want to steward and care for this space? And then how do we then host our new international friends in that environment? And I think we as a national movement are continuing to grow in our sensitivity and our intention. I really appreciated that at our ISM National Conference in Phoenix. There was acknowledgement of the Native community of the area and the brilliance of their canal system. That was really neat to learn. At my own Pacific region conference, we were in Yosemite, so we got to learn, we got to do protocol with one of the local tribes and also learn the both beautiful and painful history of the colonial expansion into their valley. And then also recently, some of you may have heard about the Ambition Conference for chapter planting, and there was also some really beautiful acknowledgement, affirmation, and voices from the Native Indigenous communities, and how do we plant well in those Native Indigenous communities. So it seems like a lot of blessing has come. The testimony of my colleagues from Hawaii that were there is that because there was such honor of Native Indigenous peoples of that land and of the United States, that the Lord is really blessing that apostolic movement. And so I think we cannot neglect this aspect, even in our international student ministry, right? So this is what we've just talked about, and I've spent about half the time, or maybe a little more, but on foundations of like, how do we form our own ethnic cultural identity and migration story? And how do we understand the people of the land in which we've settled as the foundation for our hospitality? So this is more the inner work, or the self-discovery work, or the understanding our community's work, and not directly applicable to how we interact with internationals. But if you're just itching for that, don't worry, because that's where we're going next. So, pressing my cursor from the next slide, but it's not moving at the moment. Okay, here we go. So the three aspects of hospitality I mentioned that we're covering are place, language, and nest. Again, like, where are we living? What are our migration stories? How do we leverage language in a helpful way as we welcome international students? And then how do we be real about the mess in our environments? I'd love to share my friend Nisi's story. Nisi is one of the international students I met when I started ISM in Hawaii the first semester. And she's actually a friend of friends. It was pretty neat to reconnect through those networks. But Nisi is indigenous from China. She's one of the 56 minority groups in China, the majority being Han Chinese. She is Nosu from Sichuan or Xichang province, and her people were historically pushed into the mountains by the majority Han Chinese. And so she grew up as a barefoot shepherdess in the snow. And then since her father was one of the first to get his graduate degree in English, or sorry, not in English, it might have been, but anyway, to get a graduate degree, her family has been, has grown in their academia and kind of like modernized in some ways, whereas most of her community still don't have access to healthcare and agricultural help and live on subsistence. And so her dream is to help establish schools in their mountain villages where kids can learn both in Nosu and Mandarin Chinese simultaneously, and so that they can kind of integrate into the Mandarin system. Most kids don't go to school because there isn't that kind of access for them. And so they continue to have the same challenges in their community. So as Nisi came into Hawaii, how was I to receive her as a friend and as a guest? So here's a story. Okay, wait, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. Yes. Yeah, so how could I communicate, in a relevant way in the context of Hawaii to someone like Nisi, who is indigenous and has faced those kinds of injustices in her own community? So I'm going to bring up her story as we go along, but some of the ways we practice this in our community in Hawaii, as we consider place, is that we spend time learning about Hawaiian culture. Our 3 stated values for ISM Hawaii is build friendships with other people of other nationalities, learn about Hawaii and Hawaiian culture, and thirdly, to learn about Jesus. So we really value learning about the land. And so this activity in this picture is us visiting Iolani Palace, where the monarchy used to live and rule. And so we tour the palace, but we also invite some of the Hawaiian friends in our InterVarsity movement to share their stories from contemporary life. And so it's very relevant. A lot of what international students will experience here, if they're exchange, they'll think of Hawaii as Waikiki and UH. They probably won't, and maybe some pretty hikes and beautiful plants and waterfalls, but they probably won't get to see beneath the surface. They'll see the 50th state lens, but they won't see the Hawaiian Kingdom lens. They won't maybe wrestle with why are there so many homeless here, and why are there so many Micronesians that were displaced by the U.S. government after we bombed out their islands, and how does that fit into this trajectory of colonization that has really affected the Native Indigenous population of this land, which is largely homeless and struggles economically with so much gentrification. So, they get to hear those kinds of things and how that actually affects families of some of our Hawaiian friends. We sing songs in Hawaiian, we try Hawaiian food, we also have the opportunity to visit Hui Pali, the group for Polynesian students that is led by my colleague, Moani Nanadsich. And I also invite some students to visit the Native Hawaiian church that I go to, that I attend, also pastored by my colleague Moani. So they see, so when Nisi came to my church, she saw Hawaiians worshiping in a Hawaiian way, under a tree on this peninsula, using Hawaiian and English, opening ceremony in traditional fashion with chants, and also with the blowing of the conch shell, and the giving of lei to guests. And this is starkly different from what you'll experience on most of the island in the westernized churches. But for her, as someone from an indigenous group that has recently accepted the gospel and is forming a more indigenous style church, this was super exciting and invigorating as she considers what can we do? How can we move forward in ways I'm seeing the Hawaiians have done it, have kind of decolonized Christianity? How can we do that too and be creative in how we shape our way of worship in our context? So that's place. Second, language. So God of every nation, tribe, and tongue. But how do we show that and not inadvertently perpetuate this idea that the God of the Bible is the God of the West, which most of our students probably come in thinking. This is a picture of Nisi in the light green just above me, and then Keito and Yuka, and Mark's smiling because I think because he knows Keito. She's been really involved and in the reentry kind of pioneering. And Yuka on the left, who's a TCK and was my roommate. So these are kind of the founding group of our ISM ministry. And one morning we had a little brunch together. We're talking stories, sharing from our hearts, reading some scripture. And then, as I often do, I said, well, let's pray. And let's pray in our languages. And so for some of us, that's a choice. So Yuka speaks Chinese, Japanese, Korean, English. So she can choose, And Nisi also speaks, Mandarin as well as Nosu. So I just invite them to pray in whatever language they want. So Nisi prayed, I prayed probably in English, Nisi prayed, perhaps in Mandarin because me and Yuka can understand. And then Keito prayed in Japanese, and Yuka prayed too in one of her languages. And afterwards, Nisi was crying, and she said, that meant so much to me. Now I see you two as sisters. Because when I was going to school in China and trying to learn Japanese, I was made fun of for it so much because of the existing tensions from historic, events between Taiwan and China that I gave it up. And I've had this kind of feeling or, this like kind of painfulness in regards to Japan. But in that moment, in praying together in our languages, God is breaking down barriers, breaking down walls, and that's not something we can manufacture. That was a Holy Spirit Kairos moment. And I said, I really believe what's happened here has implications widely in the spiritual realm. The Lord is doing something beautiful. And yet, even though we can't make that happen, we can allow it to happen. We can create a space where people get to pray in their languages and express who they are, worship the Creator in the tongues He's given them that He also speaks. So last kind of point of how we practice hospitality here is place, the mess in the place in which we live. So we mentioned at the beginning, Paul's story, especially just appreciating people being honest and real about what are the problems, even in our lives or our home, what are the problems in our city, in our state, in our nation. And so in U.S., nationally, we have issues of genocide being the foundation of the establishment of this United States of America, not the previous Native American tribes, America. And then we have racism being, as Condoleezza Rice says, the birth defect of our nation. And then, currently we have a president who wants to make America great again and has ideas of doing that might feel dissonant for a lot of us that want to be a little bit more culturally sensitive than he often comes across. So, as things come out in the news and might affect even students in visa or immigration processes, these are things that we want to be able to bring up and be free to share. Not only because they need to process them for themselves, but also to process them scripturally in a biblical framework and how Jesus cares about all of these things has a plan to make all things new. But also because these things have implications in their home context. So every time I'm talking about the issue of Hawaiian independence from the US, my friends that are from Taiwan or Hong Kong, they get it. They have a relatable experience of feeling oppressed by a larger power. But my Chinese friends also need to hear that story and often don't if they're just in China. So as we talk about the mess in our own context, it might bring up things in their context and be applicable. So one of my Chinese friends who's a journalist realized through his experience with us, I can use my journalism to bring justice by bringing new views and perspectives to people's minds who might not come across them. So as I get to the end here, I might go a couple minutes over, but I asked one of my student leaders, Junpei, who Mark may have also come across, but he got to visit our regional ISM student retreat a few years ago. And I asked him recently, how have you perceived like American culture in your time with ISM? And the way he answered was not at all what I was thinking, but it was so insightful. It was not what I was thinking he would answer. But he said when he was with this community that was even more diverse than our group in Hawaii, which is largely East Asian, but you know they had some folks from Central Asia and Africa. He said, "This is America. Like these people from all these diverse countries, like they look like America, like a nation of immigrants." And so I was like, "Wow, yeah, you know, like." Right, we have immigration policies and restrictions, et cetera, but like, what if we didn't see so much, I'm a host and you're a guest, which, you know, is a valuable framework, but also like, you have just as much a right to be here as I do, as a guest of the land, as someone that's not a First Nations Indigenous host. And how will that even affect the ways we think about our international friends? So in summary, you've seen this slide before, but we're part of Christ's redemptive mission. And how does that look in terms of place, in terms of language, in terms of mess? And so at this time, I'd love for us to just take a moment, maybe a minute, to think about something that might be worth exploring a little bit deeper, whether it's our own story of understanding our own migration journey. I know I have more exploration to do on that. Who are the hosts of the land? So when I went back to California after learning in the context of Hawaii, I realized I don't really know much about the Native Indigenous of Redding, California, where I lived for 9 years. So I took time to learn more and continuing to learn more about the Wintu people of that area. How might we use languages in a way that really breaks barriers? We talked about that a bit in our reentry seminar or table talk about preparing them best to go home and worship in their own nations. And then how are we, you know, able to be honest about our own mess in this context so we can explore the deeper things of God's heart for justice? So just take maybe another minute to kind of like think about personal applications of how to take this deeper, and then I'll kind of wrap this up here. So hopefully you've had some time to at least begin a thought or just finish jotting down what you were. But the bottom line of this talk is having just hospitality, as in justice-oriented hospitality, begins with us as the hosts of our international friends. And as we can bring all that we are to God and our international friends, they can also be all that they are meant to be in Him. And so as much as I go deeper in my own ethnic identity, migration story, I can then better see nuances and hear their story and celebrate that with them too. I wanted to just say also kind of a special side note about us as an ISM community. We, I think, have an increased desire for diversity and ethnic cultural awareness. And I really saw that at our ISM conference here in Phoenix. And what Katie shared, I think the way that Mark and the national team chose to prioritize and even brought in, some great voices to give different talks to us from their own cultural vantage point, friends of color in our university community. But I think for those of us who are white, serving in ISM is such a different journey than our colleagues who are people of color, who might feel pressure to seem extra American. And when I say that, I mean majority culture white American. But maybe that's not the most helpful in their hospitality either. And so what are ways that our ISM community can give space for all of our cultural expressions as ISM hosts? And I think we desire to grow in that, and we are. And so I look forward to seeing how that develops. So since we're at 12:02, I want to say, thank you so much for joining. I'll just maybe post some resources here, especially for folks watching the video. But I would love for any of you that can stay for another 10 or so minutes, like to hear some more thoughts from you, feedback. I'm going to even have some kind of like gritty questions I'd love to like dialogue over in terms of how we move this forward in ISM. But yeah, first of all, just opening up the floor. Any thoughts, feedback, questions?
Rachel, I'm wondering if you, like in your ministry in Hawaii or in California before or anywhere else as you learned about this, have you pressed much into doing theology contextually? So going from not only just our stories and our experience and how we interact, but then also, because I'm thinking like in the bit I've learned about this, I feel like there's a level where in InterVarsity we are more familiar talking about our cultures and what we bring to the table culturally and dig into those conversations. But then a lot of time our theological approaches, how we express the gospel, and not just the gospel, but all the aspects of ministry and what we're trying to build and things, still we are almost blind to the ways that is influenced by our cultural approaches too. So have you pressed on that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just personally, I've been wanting to go to seminary, but I feel held back because I don't want to have all my Western ideas, theological ideas, just reinforced. I feel like living in this Hawaiian context, learning from my Native Indigenous friends has I've unlearned a lot of things. And I wonder if I went back into a Western theological context, if I would kind of not hold on or retain kind of these things I've unlearned. And so even with Fuller, and I was recently talking with one of our staff colleagues who also teaches at Fuller, and I kind of voiced this concern to him. He said, you would have Western theological ideas reinforced. And yet Fuller's intentionally bringing in a lot of great voices. And so his perspective also was that, because I've wondered for years, why isn't there more accessible theology coming from other corners of the earth? And he said, kind of I guess in the same way English is the lingua franca, Western or European-based theology has been kind of the standard moving things, and I use that word very carefully, the standard kind of moving things forward. Yeah, I think Nate's is the place I've come across the most contextualized theology being done in a authentically decolonizing way, because these folks are Native Indigenous. They're not Westerners trying to decolonize something that's Western, but they're really doing it in their context. I also have insight from him and other folks that seminaries in other countries often are more Western than say Fuller, because they similar to the way missions was done in Japan, it's brought in that traditional model of the mid last century, and then that's what's retained. So I think I desire for my own growth and spiritual formation more diverse theological influences, and I'm always open to more. But is there something else you want to say on that, or did I respond? to what you were thinking.
No, I kind of feel like it's just conversations that I find interesting. It was relevant overseas in Bosnia, but in the same way it's relevant in international student ministry here. I think from my time at Fuller, maybe any seminary without any kind of life framework or with a really limited, really narrow life framework, you just, if you don't know there's other waters to swim in, then you're not going to even know what questions to ask that you're not knowing. So I think it's true of, especially maybe like a Master's of Divinity or Theology program, it's going to be Western theology. I think a missiology at Fuller was great for approaching things as one of the questions on one of my classes posed was, is Western theological history elected by God as proper theology, or is it one theological strain? And the professor didn't even have danced that. He just proposed lots of stuff. We did readings from other cultures. And I think still that, would be tremendously boosted through your experience in Hawaii and your own life. But I don't know, I just think it's interesting. There's a whole lot more that gets into that. But I don't know, I'm chewing a lot in ministry with reentry and how this is all part of reentry. You're right at the very beginning, you mentioned a church in Japan that looks extremely Western. You said even as the Western church has broken some of those molds that's retained it over there, I'm guessing those are ways that don't look very Japanese.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's great insights, Darren. And just one other thought to kind of add on to that or play onto that is maybe in some cases, certain churches are like trying to shed some of those Western forms that are not like fully authentic in who they are. And in other cases, like newer contexts like the Nosu in China, now, they're new and they're trying to form church and worship and theology in the context of their community. So yeah, regardless of who they are, I want to learn from those folks. I think I, as a cross-cultural learning person, like always need to learn from those perspectives. Yeah. Thanks, Darren. Other thoughts or feedback, questions? You can also feel free to email me if you want to be more. Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, of the three things, the place, language, mess, when I jotted down a few things, I was just thinking language in many of our contexts, ISM, and just even more broadly in IV, I believe there's growing openness and practice of inviting people to pray in their heart language or even in another language they've just learned, so that there's that experience in prayer and scripture. But I do feel like in listening today, an area that it feels like we really, really lack is bringing in cultural aspects and forms with music and worship. And especially because we're working with college students, young adults, I'm wondering how more of that story and their history can be brought forward into our conference context. Whether it's regional or Urbana, or just our regular gatherings. That's one that I'd like to press into and invite some other people that have music and ethnomusicology backgrounds to help us with.
Wow, wouldn't that be wonderful and rich? Even if we had like a compilation of songs from 7 countries, like on a CD, or things that even we can learn to offer to our communities. That's a really neat idea, Paul. I like that. Yeah, and also another thing I didn't mention in my sharing about language was not only do I desire to invite my international friends to pray in their language, but I also seek to pray in their languages as best I can, even if it's just a phrase. So in Chinese, I can do an okay job kind of saying a simple prayer. And I don't speak Japanese, but I might be able to say, arigato kami-sama, and I can say, thank you, God, in their language. And that's my way of also trying to say, like, I acknowledge he's the God of the Japanese people. And I even say that a lot, because I don't want them to think God of the Americans. That's been communicated for too long, but how can I then sort of break that down by using this white face to say, he is the God of your people, and how can I learn from that too? Yeah. We have a couple more minutes. Katie, looks like you're...
I just love what you're presenting here. One thing that occurred to me in the question about who are the hosts. Okay, living in the South, there are a lot of African Americans who wow. And yet most of our friendship family programs around here, or those kinds of things, there's white people.
Mm.
And at Christmas time, our next door neighbors are African American Christians, and they always decorate their house about twice as nice as mine. So in advance, I asked them, I said, I'm having non-Chinese over, and they've never been to an American home with Christmas. Can we come and see yours?
Oh.
They opened the house, they talked and entertained. And so that was another way of having another Christian group be a host.
That's really neat. Oh.
So I was pleased with that. And the other thing is this thing about being honest and facing what's going on. Another big concern in the South is that, unfortunately, so many, or at least a few well-known, quote-unquote, evangelical Christians are continuing to support President Trump. And it could be really very negative for our witness.
Yeah.
A lot of international students. So as difficult as it is, this last point about talking about the mess could be really helpful, so that students begin to see how even people who think they're Christians can be negatively impacted by their culture.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where I think that's where we feel the rub, right? Because I know for myself, like, I'm not even sure how to have those conversations. I could get it started. I don't know how to have those conversations with other white Americans oftentimes, my own family oftentimes, right? But
right. Yeah. You know, it's like, I was thinking about it, and I don't want to talk about it because a lot of my supporters, I mean, MPD,
that too.
Even now, still supporting President Trump. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's so negative with the students. So,
and so, like, how do we even evoke compassion in the midst of that discussion, or, toward those that like have such a different perspective than us, right? And affirm that they are probably really genuine followers of Jesus too, with a really different idea.
Right, and because my friend is always asking, how can these people possibly be Christian?
Yeah.
And when I come back to it, I say, well, think about it. You know, probably some of our ancestors owned slaves. And among some of our ancestors, I think probably one or two of them actually really knew Jesus. So culture is a powerful blinder. And that would be another thing to bring out as we're looking at history and sharing the negative part of our history, is how people who genuinely follow Jesus can be so blinded by their culture. And we use ourselves as an example.
Yeah, that's good.
And then maybe people, if they need to, can apply it to others.
That's great. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Katie. I'm sure there's so much more there, but that's really good stuff.
I was tempted to think too that, because here in Ohio, there of course is a rich Native history in this state. I live in Cuyahoga County. It's an Indian word. The word Ohio is an Indian word, and so on. So, but I was thinking when you were sharing, because you live so much closer to indigenous folks, so to say, Rachel, in Hawaii than we do here. There's not really a reservation in Ohio, as an example. I was thinking it's, making those connections is a little bit more of a challenge. So I think that part of this is affirming our international students' own cultures, because we're taking a wider look at the impact that culture has on gospel and what it means to practice Christian faith. It's inevitably in cultural terms, of course, but we have opportunities to speak to that. And so certainly the conversation we have that's going on in our country now between ethnicities in the U.S., which includes Native peoples, of course, too, but sort of, it raises many of the same kinds of issues that of the nature of culture and gospel that international students need to appreciate too. So I'm really appreciative of how sensitively you've portrayed this, and how those categories of place, language, and mess. I really like the phrase mess too. What that implies. Maybe one final thought on that point is I was thinking about this fact that Native Americans are not often talked about here. But if I'm allowed to share my screen just for a minute, I don't know if it'll come up, or I have to get permission from you maybe. But
oh, I think it is.
Can you all see this?
Yep.
So this is Chief Wahoo. This is until 2019 is going to continue to be the mascot and symbol of the Cleveland Indians professional baseball team. And it's been a big controversy for many years. But it just occurred to me, that this is the kind of thing, this symbol that's, worn by all these players and is, put up in a stadium in downtown Cleveland.
Yeah.
Is an opportunity for us to talk about this, because journalists have said things like, well, I don't associate Chief Wahoo with any Indian person. It just reminds me of summer and baseball and lemonade and family times at the ballpark and, those sorts of things. What an opportunity for us to be able to talk, with people about what this means. I'm finally glad that we're actually ending this gross racial symbol, racist symbol, as part of our own baseball team here. Anyway, so.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. And I've been hearing that in the news too, and glad that they're taking that step. But yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and even the point that while I live in a place where I can see and touch and interact with Hawaiian culture, indigenous culture in my context easily, it might seem, might feel harder in a lot of other contexts. And I think even that aspect is an indication of how far removed we are from our colonial history. That it's that hard to find, that our cities or communities don't have ways of honoring or celebrating those cultures. And so it does require us to work harder to find it, if that is our desired intention. And if there, as I have opportunity, I love to also share in different intervarsity spaces that I think in order to move our movement forward in multi-ethnicity racial reconciliation, we have to put more emphasis on the Native Indigenous layer of this journey. Because if we are trying, with all of those of us that have settled for one reason or another, forced or by choice, in the land of what's now called the United States or the Americas, and we're trying to reconcile between white, black, white, Latino, black, all these Asian, all the communities that are immigrant communities, like us as immigrant communities, white people. We can't really get to the bottom of it unless we acknowledge that root level, of the Native Indigenous communities. And I think we, as Americans, have a lot to learn and to listen to the Native American church and the Native American voice. And we have opportunities now, especially through Richard Twiss's, the books he's published. And I do want to just kind of give another shout out for a book that I've loved and has been so super forming by Twiss, One Church, Many Tribes. And while, he's speaking quite contextually to the Native American experience of a colonized Christianity and then a process of trying to decolonize the church, I think this has applications for other cross-cultural work, in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you've tried to read his other book, Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys, which of course he wasn't alive to edit and fully, flesh out, that's a hard read. That's like a thesis. This one's way more just accessible. So I highly recommend. Also not IVP, so you'll have to also maybe pay a little bit more money to get it, but it's so highly worth it. So yeah. And just last book plug, because I just can't help myself. The Heart of, and many of us have read this book, I'm sure, but The Heart of Racial Reconciliation by Brenda Salter McNeil, and really any Brenda Salter McNeil book. I've read a handful of them, and every time I'm just so enriched. And but this one I think goes a little deeper than some of her others, and it's helped me acknowledge shortcomings in my own perspective of my white identity. Yeah. So man, thank you so much to each of you for taking the time on your Friday to be part of listening to kind of what I've been formulating and then having some dialogue. I really appreciate it. And also feel free, to email me, and anyone that's watching this video later, feel free to contact me to have more dialogue on these topics, as I'm still forming, or ask questions. So you can find my email address. It's rachel.kuhn@intervarsity.org. So yeah, I think I'll end the recording now, if that's okay.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great.
Thank you very much.
You.
Really good.
Very well.